Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's Monday Minutes. It's Tuesday afternoon, which is why I'm sitting in my office on campus. But I wanted to go through a couple of things with you that are things I noticed some students having problems with on the brain quiz, and also a couple of things I wanted to mention about this week's material, which deals with the cranial nerves and the sensory receptors. So let's begin by taking a look at some of the slides in the brain lecture. I think the problem that I saw on the quiz most often was that people were trying to tell me different parts of the brain and mentioned instead parts of the brain as well as other structures that might have been located in and around the brain, but were not considered parts of the brain. Remember, the brain is made out of nervous tissue, and nervous tissue is made out of neurons and glial cells. So when we talk about the brain and the spinal cord, which are the central nervous system, as well as the structures that are in the peripheral nervous system, we're talking about nervous tissue. So the things that contain neurons and glial cells. So one of the questions on the quiz asked you about where the gray matter was found in the brain. And several of you told me that it was located in the cortex or the cortices of the cerebrum. But remember, that's only one place where gray matter is found. Gray matter, remember, includes the collection of neuron cell bodies. So yes, it does overlie the cerebral cortices, but it's also found in deeper regions of the brain that we call nuclei or deep nuclei. So remember, all of the parts that we've discussed, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, the cerebellum, all of those structures are composed of nervous tissue and contain both gray matter and white matter. So all of those structures have to be included in where gray matter is located. It's located in nuclei that are found in the thalamus, nuclei that are found in the hypothalamus, in the midbrain, and so on. Remember from this slide, here's the cerebral cortices, the gray matter in the cerebral cortices, but even the cerebrum has deep nuclei, gray matter that is found in deeper regions of the brain. Remember, we said the cerebrum includes the amygdala and a region called the hippocampus. Remember, the cerebrum has gray matter in multiple places, in these cortices and in the deep nuclei. I've moved on to slide number 21 here in the brain lecture. The other question on the quiz that some people had trouble with was this question about the developmental divisions in the brain. Remember, sometimes we talk about the brain just in terms of the structures that we see with our eyes. So we talk about the two cerebral hemispheres, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. But when we want to talk about the functions of the brain, when we're learning about the functions of the different parts of the brain, we often use the terms forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. These are the three developmental divisions of the brain. So remember that the forebrain is composed of the cerebral hemispheres as well as the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Those three things together make up the forebrain. The hindbrain also contains three different structures in it: the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain has only one structure in it, and I've added this in now to this slide. The midbrain contains the midbrain. The midbrain is the most proximal region of the brain stem, or what I called the upper portion of the brainstem. But it has a name. It's called the midbrain. So the developmental region that is called the midbrain contains one structural region called the midbrain. And that region, that structural area known as the midbrain, is located in the upper portion of the brainstem. Similarly, the pons and the medulla oblongata are two separate structures made of nervous tissue that are found as part of the hindbrain. The pons, the medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum together make up the hindbrain. Now, structurally, the pons and the medulla oblongata constitute the lower portion of the brainstem, but these are two different discrete regions. They have functional differences. So when I ask you the parts of the brain, the nervous tissue, that we find in the hindbrain, I want you to tell me the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. I've moved forward now to slide number 37 in the lecture. This slide was talking about a couple of the functions that the hypothalamus performs. Remember, there are 5. So on this slide, we can see function 2 and function 3. I wanted to draw your attention to function 3 because so far in the course, we've talked an awful lot about how the body regulates its core body temperature. If you remember at the beginning of the semester, when we were learning about the stimulus response pathway, we used temperature control as an example. We also talked about the afferent and efferent neural pathways that are involved in temperature regulation, because the control center for temperature regulation is part of the nervous system. It's the hypothalamus. You now know a lot, or you should know a lot, about how the human body regulates its core body temperature. Make sure that in your study materials, in your notes, and in your topic concentration guides for the final exam, somewhere you have notes about all of the specific ways that our human body regulates our core body temperature. I can almost guarantee you that it's going to show up on the final exam. And just to reiterate this point, on slide number 41, we discussed the structures that are located within the midbrain. We talked about the tectum, the tegmentum, and the crus cerebri. These are the 3 regions within the midbrain. Remember, the midbrain is one of the developmental regions of the brain. The midbrain contains only one structural region, and it's called the midbrain. If I ask you to describe for me what structures are found within the midbrain, that is when I would want you to describe the tectum, the tegmentum, and the crus cerebri. I'm going to switch gears now and say a couple things about the sensory receptors and the cranial nerves. The first thing I want to do is apologize because I realized that I posted a set of slides for you this week that didn't match with the video posted on our playlist. It was an older version of the slides, and if you opened them up, you saw that in the slides we talked about the cranial nerves first and then the sensory receptors. And in the video we talk about the sensory receptors first and then the cranial nerves. So I have fixed that issue now. The set of slides that is now posted for you matches the video on our playlist. So in the lecture we talked about sensory receptors, we talked about what they are, and we talked about how they transmit information. Remember, your body is covered with these receptors. They are located across all of the surfaces of your body, both external and internal. So a lot of these sensors, yes, a lot of these receptors are located on your skin, but not all of them. You have receptors in all of your internal organs and organ systems because we need to detect and deliver sensory information to the central nervous system, not just about what's happening outside of our body, but also what's happening inside. So in the lecture, we discussed the 4 kinds of information that receptors are going to pick up, that they're going to detect and send along afferent sensory pathways in the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. We talked about modality or type of information, the location of the receptors, the intensity, and the duration. In the lecture, we discussed primarily modality or type and location. I didn't really say much more about intensity or duration. I just wanted to add in a couple more things for you to be aware of. Remember, when we're talking about sensory receptors and we talk about the intensity of the information, the receptor is going to alter the intensity of the information that it's transmitting by how frequently it is firing along the afferent sensory nerve and the absolute number of firings. Okay, so there's a difference between a pressure receptor receiving a small amount of pressure and a large amount of pressure. If it's receiving a small amount of pressure, it has to transmit that small amount of information along the afferent sensory nerves. It does that by reducing how often it fires off an action potential. So the absolute number of action potentials that are going to be generated along the afferent sensory nerve is going to be relatively low. If the receptor picks up a large amount of pressure, then it's going to increase the number of action potentials, absolutely, by firing more frequently. It's that difference in intensity that the central nervous system will be able to pick up and interpret as meaning differences in the pressure stimulus. When I use this term duration, I'm referring to how long that receptor is going to fire. How long is it going to continue to send information about whatever signals it's receiving? How long is it going to continue to send information along that afferent sensory nerve pathway to the central nervous system? Now, you can imagine that there are some forms of stimulation that just kind of go on and on. We're always seeing things, for example, if we're awake. We're always receiving information in terms of the amount of light that can be perceived by our eyes and the types of objects that are in front of our eyes. We're always hearing things, at least to some degree. We're also always receiving information about things like temperature and so on. So a lot of receptors are going to be firing almost constantly. And it's important that our nervous system doesn't get overloaded with information. In other words, our nervous system has to learn to distinguish between sensory information that it needs to pay attention to right now and sensory information that it doesn't need to pay attention to right now. So one of the things that I wanted to mention that we don't talk about in the lecture is this idea of adaptation. Receptors are capable of adapting across time. In other words, if a receptor is getting repeatedly stimulated with the same level of intensity over some time duration, if it's getting the same information over and over and over and over again, and it keeps transmitting that information to the central nervous system, that may not be a type of sensory information that the brain needs to pay attention to all the time. One of the best examples of this we can see in terms of touch. It's possible for the human skin to receive sensory information about touch that it will pay attention to at first, but then it will essentially ignore over time. I want you to think about how your clothes feel on your body. If you pay attention to how your shirt is touching, for example, the skin on your back, or how your shirt is touching your shoulders or touching your arms, if you pay attention to it, you can feel it. But most of the time during the day, your brain is not registering the touch sensation of your clothing on your body. Your receptors are starting to adapt, in other words. The clothing is still touching your body. The receptors are still receiving the information about touch, but they are not transmitting that information at the same intensity and for the same duration. And that's because the brain doesn't need to respond to that kind of touch across time. There are more important things for the brain to be paying attention to. Now, the reason I bring this up is because most receptors are capable of this process of adaptation. In other words, learning to sort of ignore repeated stimulation at the same level of intensity across a long duration of time. Most receptors can start to ignore that. But there's one glaring exception, and that's the nociceptors. Remember, nociceptors are receptors that are capable of being stimulated and transmitting information about pain. Remember, pain is an interesting sensation because it's not real in the sense that you can't touch it, you can't measure it objectively. In other words, pain is unique in each person's body. We talked about how pain serves an important function in the body. Number one, it calls our attention, our immediate attention to something. And number two, it encourages us to stop doing whatever we're doing. So my example is always if I place my hand down on the surface of the stove onto a hot burner, yes, thermoreceptors in my skin are going to start firing, but so are nociceptors. That pain receptor, the purpose of the information that it's sending is to immediately draw my attention to the fact that I have placed my hand on the burner and to get me to remove my hand from the burner. So draw our attention and get us to stop. Remember, there are some times when we can override our nociceptors. We talked a little bit about athletic events and about how at higher levels of athletic performance, the athlete has to learn how to ignore pain sensation. A lot of people ran the Boston Marathon yesterday, and a whole lot of people, as they were running those 26 miles, had to ignore the pain of that athletic event. They had to continue to run, despite the fact that their nociceptors were telling their brain, by sending information along afferent sensory pathways to the central nervous system, the nociceptors were trying desperately to get those people to notice that running 26 miles hurts and also to stop. That pain signaling is trying to get those runners to stop running. And of course, the successful runners learn to ignore that. They learn to override that information. But here's what you need to remember. That is not adaptation. It's not the receptor that's adapting when it comes to pain. It's our central nervous system that's doing that. We are choosing voluntarily to ignore pain. It's not that the nociceptors are altering the amount of information that they're sending. It's not that the nociceptors are becoming reduced in sensitivity. That's not what that is. We can choose in our central nervous system, in our higher brain centers, we can choose to ignore pain. But the nociceptors themselves are not capable of adaptation. Now, if you think about that from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. If our nociceptors were capable of adaptation, it would be possible for our nociceptors to stop firing if we got into a situation where we were receiving the same level of stimulus at the same intensity across the same duration, a long duration. So something very serious, again, like the example of being burned. We need our nociceptors to keep transmitting that pain message, even if the burning process continues. We don't want to adapt to pain from the receptor standpoint because it could end up damaging us or killing us. So pain receptors are the only types of receptors that don't adapt. And that's because they need to provide the same level of stimulus reception regardless of how long that stimulus occurs. It's protective. It helps to keep us alive. The only other thing that I wanted to mention today is something that comes out of the Cranial Nerves lecture. And this is sort of an example of being careful not to miss the forest because of the trees. When we're learning about the nervous system, there's so much information that we need to remember. The peripheral nervous system is extremely complex. So is the central nervous system. It's a lot of information that you're learning in a short amount of time. And it's possible for us to get so bogged down in the details that we forget some of the big picture. So one of the things I want you to do when you're studying the nervous system and preparing for the final exam is I want you to take a step back and just make sure that you're remembering some of the key sort of overview of your nervous system and how your nervous system is structured. Remember that your central nervous system consists of a brain and a spinal cord. Everything else, everything outside of your brain and spinal cord is your peripheral nervous system. Your peripheral nervous system is sending information to your central nervous system along afferent sensory pathways. Your central nervous system is interpreting all of that information and deciding on a response. And your central nervous system will send that response back out to the peripheral nervous system along efferent motor pathways to some effector tissue. This means that information is constantly traveling between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, the spinal cord and the body, the brain and the body. There are pathways that transmit sensory information from the body to the spinal cord and from the body to the brain. There are other pathways that send information from the spinal cord to the body and from the brain to the body. It's the connection between the body and the spinal cord and the connection between the brain and the body that involves spinal nerves and cranial nerves. Don't forget what spinal nerves do. Don't forget what cranial nerves do. Information can travel from the peripheral nervous system into the spinal cord. That would be sensory information. It's going to travel into the spinal cord through the sensory branch of a spinal nerve. And we call that sensory branch a dorsal root. When efferent information comes back out of the central nervous system, back to the body, that's going to travel out a motor pathway. And it's going to leave the spinal cord through a spinal nerve to get to the body. This time it's going to travel through the ventral root of a spinal nerve. So spinal nerves connect the spinal cord and the body. Spinal nerves can receive sensory information, or I should say, sensory information can be transmitted through spinal nerves to the spinal cord through the dorsal branch. Motor information can be sent out from the spinal cord to the body through a ventral branch of a spinal nerve. All right? Now, let's think about pathways between the brain and the body. This is where the cranial nerves come in. Now, we don't see a ventral and a dorsal branch to our cranial nerves. Instead, some of our cranial nerves are purely sensory. Some of our cranial nerves are purely motor. But many of our cranial nerves have mixed function. So the same nerve can carry both sensory and motor fibers within it. Sensory information from the body, as it comes toward the brain, it's going to get into the brain sometimes through a cranial nerve. And sometimes when the brain sends out motor information, it's going to send it out to the body through a cranial nerve. It is true that sometimes it's the brain to the spinal cord to the body. That's going to travel through a spinal nerve. Sometimes it's the body sending sensory information through the spinal cord to the brain. That's going to travel through a spinal nerve. But sometimes the spinal cord is removed from the pathway. Sensory information can travel from the body directly to the brain through cranial nerves. Motor information can travel from the brain directly to the body through cranial nerves. And the last thing I'll mention today is this. You're looking at a drawing here that I didn't include in the lecture, the video lecture, but I wanted to show it to you because this is a drawing that shows the distribution of some of the cranial nerves, including cranial nerve 10, which is the vagus nerve. Remember, the vagus nerve is the most widely distributed cranial nerve, and this picture really drives that idea home. In the picture, we can see the brain, part of the brain here, we can see part of the brain stem, we can see part of the cerebellum, and then we see spinal cord. You can see some cranial nerves coming off. You can see a cranial nerve here. This is, I believe, cranial nerve 2. Here's cranial nerve 7. Here's cranial nerve 9. This is cranial nerve 10. This is the vagus nerve. And I want you to notice how extensively it travels through your body. It's got input to your cardiovascular system. It's got input to your respiratory system. It's got input to your gastrointestinal system. It's got input to your urogenital system. This nerve is so important in terms of the impact that it has throughout your body. That's all I have for you today. Remember that next week we have our final lecture about the autonomic nervous system. Next week is also when you'll take your final common assessment for the class. The following week, you'll take your final exam for the lecture portion of the course. All I want to remind you of today is that the final common assessment, again, that takes place next week. That's an open note assessment. That's the one that's going to have a lot of multiple choice questions in it, and then a multi-part essay question. That final common assessment is worth 40 points, or 5% of your lecture grade. It is open note. So to prepare for that, the very best thing you can do is get your notes in order. Get your topic concentration guides in order. Know, in other words, where you can find certain lecture information in that topic concentration guide. The key to the final common assessment is time management. So you're allowed to use your notes, use them, and make sure you know where things are within your notes, so you're not wasting time sort of shuffling through your notes when you can't remember an answer to a question. The final exam is going to cover nervous tissue. That's all that will be on it, but that's plenty. Remember, like all of the lecture exams, your final exam is closed note, closed book. You have to memorize the material that's in the topic concentration guide for this last unit. Okay? So, I wouldn't study for the final common assessment in the same way you need to study for the final exam. The final common assessment is going to have questions from all of the units that we've done this semester, including the one we're doing right now. But it's open note. So as long as you've been taking good lecture notes, as long as you've been sort of customizing your topic concentration guides throughout the course, you're going to be fine. You just need to have your information in front of you in a good orderly way so that you can access what you need quickly. The final exam is different. The final lecture exam requires you to memorize what you've learned about the nervous system. You'll have to memorize that topic concentration guide. All right, as always, if you have any comments or questions, please message me through the Canvas inbox.